Something is shifting in the Middle East, and for the first time since this war began, we may finally be able to see where it's heading. Stay with us through this one, because the picture that's emerging is complicated, consequential, and frankly, more dramatic than anything we've seen in months. And if you want deeper coverage, expert analysis, and stories we often break before the major outlets pick them up, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us keep doing this work. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening. For several months now, the war that ignited in February has been defined more by what hasn't happened than by what has. There's been no decisive military breakthrough, no diplomatic resolution, no clean endgame on either side, just an ongoing, grinding confrontation between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, with both sides absorbing costs they publicly refuse to acknowledge. But something emerged this week that could change that calculus entirely. Iran has reportedly put a new proposal on the table. Through Pakistani intermediaries, Tehran floated the idea of reopening the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping, one of the most significant economic pressure points in the entire conflict, in exchange for the United States lifting its naval blockade on Iranian ports. The nuclear question, which has been the central sticking point of every diplomatic conversation for years, would be set aside entirely and dealt with at a later stage. On the surface, that might sound like a reasonable compromise, but the subtext here is far more revealing than the text itself. For months, Iran's strategy has been built on a fairly coherent bet that Washington would eventually grow tired of this campaign, that the American public's appetite for an open-ended military commitment would erode, and that the Islamic Republic only needed to survive long enough to outlast American political will. It was a strategy that had logic behind it. Neither the United States nor Israel appeared willing to commit ground forces to a full-scale campaign, and the air strikes alone, as devastating as they were never going to topple a regime that has spent nearly 5 decades constructing itself specifically to survive external pressure. That strategy, however, assumes you can take the hits and keep going, and the signals coming out of Tehran right now suggest that absorbing those hits is becoming considerably harder than the regime expected. The fact that Iran is now willing to separate the nuclear file from the economic one, to essentially say, let's deal with the money problem first and worry about the weapons program later, is a meaningful shift. Countries that believe they have the upper hand don't typically make that kind of offer. Countries that are running out of breathing room do. So what exactly is squeezing them? The short answer is everything, simultaneously. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports has been estimated to cost Iran somewhere in the range of $435 million every single day in blocked exports and disrupted imports. That number is almost hard to process, so let's put it in context. Before the war began, roughly a third of Iran's oil revenue that moved through the Strait of Hormuz was dedicated specifically to funding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and paying the salaries of military personnel. With oil exports now essentially at a standstill, that funding stream has collapsed, and Iran is not just running out of money, it is running out of places to put the oil it can't sell. Analysts have estimated that Iran's storage capacity will reach maximum capacity within approximately 2 weeks of the recording of this episode, at which point they would be forced to begin shutting down oil wells. Once you shut down a well, restarting it is not a simple switch-flip operation. The economic damage compounds. The Treasury Department in Washington has been spearheading this economic campaign with what officials have described as the financial equivalent of a military offensive. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been explicit about the intent. This is not a passive sanctions regime. It is an active, escalating pressure campaign designed to choke off Iran's remaining financial lifelines. In mid-April, the Treasury sanctioned what became known as the Shamardi Oil Network, a multi-billion-dollar smuggling operation run through front companies based in the way that had been quietly moving Iranian crude to international buyers. The following week brought more sanctions, targeting a major Chinese petrochemical refiner that had been one of Iran's most important remaining customers, along with over 40 shipping firms and the freezing of more than $340 million in cryptocurrency linked to Iranian financial networks. And this is happening against a backdrop that was already catastrophic before the first bombs fell. By late February, the Iranian rial had already lost roughly 60% of its value compared to just the previous year. To give you a sense of what that means in practical terms, one US dollar currently buys approximately 1.5 million Iranian rials. Food inflation had crossed 100% by February, with staple goods like bread and cereals approaching inflation rates closer to 140%. These are the kinds of numbers that don't stay abstract for long. They show up at kitchen tables, they fuel protests, and indeed it was Precisely this kind of domestic economic desperation that triggered the wave of protests that set this whole sequence of events in motion back in late December. Add to this a complete internet blackout across the country now in its 8th consecutive week that is estimated to cost between $30 and $40 million per day in direct economic losses and has now crossed $2 billion in cumulative damage since the start of the war, the foundation for the defense of democracies. Has placed total war-related economic damage to Iran at roughly $144 billion, though Iran's own internal assessment puts the figure closer to $270 billion, a number that includes extensive infrastructure claims that should be viewed with considerable skepticism given that it forms the basis of a compensation demand. Somewhere between those two figures lies the reality, and that reality, wherever exactly it lands, represents a genuine crisis. None of this means the Islamic Republic is on the verge of collapse. That would be a serious misreading of what we're seeing. This is a regime that has endured crippling sanctions for decades, that has faced international isolation, domestic unrest, and external military pressure before and survived it all. The apparatus of state control remains intact. The security services remain functional. The supreme leadership has not shown any signs of fracturing, but survival and comfort are different things, and the proposal Tehran floated through Islamabad this week tells us something important. The war has shaken them more than they have publicly let on. On the American side, the picture is more complicated than Washington's public posture suggests. Talks between the two sides were originally scheduled for the weekend, with senior U.S. envoys preparing to make the trip to Pakistan for a fresh round of negotiations. Iran's foreign minister did land in Islamabad. He then refused to meet his American counterparts, citing the continuation of the naval blockade as making talks pointless. The U.S. declined to lift the blockade. The American delegation's departure was cancelled, and by Sunday, the Iranian foreign minister had already departed Pakistan for Oman. President Trump told reporters that the United States held all the cards and added that his team was not going to spend 15 hours on planes to receive proposals that fell short of what was needed. It's the kind of statement that projects confidence, but the cancellation of the talks itself suggests the path forward is anything but straightforward. Washington is now clearly betting that time and economic pressure are on its side that it can sit back and let the blockade do what bombers alone could not. The question is whether that bet holds. Meanwhile, the conflict has produced a situation in Lebanon that, in any other context, would be remarkable enough to be the lead story on its own. Lebanon has spent decades as a country divided against itself on the question of Hezbollah, a powerful armed faction with deep roots in the Shia community, financial backing from Iran, and enough military capability to essentially function as a state within a state. Successive Lebanese governments tried to work around this reality, rather than confront it, because confronting it directly risked tearing the country apart along sectarian lines. The 2024 ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah came with a disarmament plan attached, one that was supposed to proceed in stages, beginning south of the Litani River. In January, Lebanese armed forces declared they had completed the first phase of that plan, though they were careful in their language describing the achievement of a state monopoly on arms in what they called an effective and tangible way, while stopping short of claiming anything close to full disarmament. That careful language was itself a signal. Roughly 10,000 rockets and 400 missiles were removed from the area, which sounds significant until you consider that this represented only a fraction of the stockpile believed to exist in the region before the war. When escalation resumed in March of this year, even that partial progress unraveled. The Lebanese armed forces commander reportedly declined to deploy his forces against Hezbollah while Israeli military operations were ongoing, effectively stepping aside and allowing Hezbollah to retain territory and influence that the disarmament process had been intended to address. American officials were not subtle about their frustration. The U.S. envoy to Syria told Lebanese officials bluntly and publicly to stop with what he called the obvious evasion. And yet, something genuinely unexpected has been emerging from the wreckage of all of this. Lebanon now has a president it went without one for over 2 years, while Hezbollah's political veto paralyzed the process, and a new prime minister who has staked his government's credibility on the idea that Lebanon speaks with one voice, its own, and that its sovereignty is non-negotiable. There have been direct, ambassador-level talks between Lebanese and Israeli officials, something that would have been unthinkable even a year ago. Both sides agreed last Thursday to a 3-week extension to their ceasefire, buying time to try to bridge the gaps between their negotiating positions. Those gaps are significant. Israeli Defense Minister Katz has been calling for a deep, multi-layered defensive perimeter along the southern Lebanese border, explicitly drawing on models used along Gaza's border to describe how he envisions securing the line. Lebanon's position begins from the opposite premise entirely. Prime Minister Salam has been clear any sustainable deal requires full Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory. That is not a negotiating opening position. That is the only framework under which a Lebanese government can sell any deal domestically, a sovereignty-based government that accepts ongoing Israeli military presence on Lebanese soil. Isn't a government for long? And even if that gap could somehow be bridged through creative diplomatic language, the harder problem is waiting on the other side. The second phase of the disarmament plan covering Hezbollah's positions north of the Litani is where the group has explicitly drawn its own line. Hezbollah has made clear that it considers the 2024 ceasefire agreement to apply only to the south of the river, and its posture toward even the southern disarmament process was at best passively non-cooperative. North of the Litani is a completely different conversation. Lebanese security analysts have been direct about what any laugh attempt to disarm Hezbollah there would look like. Violent resistance from the group, with the real possibility of reigniting civil conflict along sectarian lines in a country that has already been through it once and cannot easily afford to go through it again. For more than 1 million Lebanese displaced from their homes, representing more than 20% of the entire country's population, none of this is abstract. It is the question of whether they get to go home. Israel destroyed the main bridges crossing the Litani River, effectively cutting off residents who fled north from returning south. Israeli officials have said clearly that those returns will not be possible until Israel is satisfied that the security architecture in the south is fundamentally different from what it was before. What that architecture looks like, and whether any Lebanese government can agree to it and survive politically, remains entirely unresolved. And then there is Israel itself, which is fighting this war from a position of genuine military dominance but growing domestic exhaustion. Israel has been at war continuously since October 7, 2023, that is 2.5 years. In that time, it has fought Iran twice, occupied significant parts of Gaza, operated across southern Lebanon, reinforced the West Bank, and established a buffer zone in Syria. The military accomplishments in that period have been real. The damage done to Iran's network of regional proxies and allies has been extensive, and the casualty ratios have been, by historical standards, remarkably favorable to Israel. But military success and political resolution are not the same thing, and an increasing number of Israelis are asking whether all of this fighting has actually changed anything fundamental. Before October 7, Hamas controlled Gaza. Hamas still controls Gaza. Before October 7, Iran had a supreme leader. Iran still has a supreme leader. Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed in the aftermath of the October 7 attacks to, as he put it, change the face of the Middle East. He said it again recently, nearly word for word. Opposition leaders have noted the gap between that promise and what has actually been delivered. Think tanks in London have described what they call strategic fatigue setting in across Israeli society, a condition in which the public still broadly supports the stated objectives of the war but has lost faith in the government's ability to convert military dominance into anything resembling a lasting peace. That loss of faith is creating political space that Netanyahu's opponents are beginning to fill. Two of the more prominent opposition figures, Yair Lapid and former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, announced last Sunday that they were merging their parties into a single political alliance ahead of elections scheduled for October. Netanyahu's governing coalition, which was itself a fragile construction reached only after the country endured 5 elections in 4 years, is showing fresh cracks. The Israeli Supreme Court issued a sweeping ruling on the question of drafting ultra-Orthodox Jewish men into the military, an issue that has been a slow-burning political crisis for years. The ultra-Orthodox community, whose numbers have grown dramatically over recent decades, has historically been exempt from conscription on religious grounds. That exemption made a certain kind of sense when the community was small. It makes much less sense when the country is fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. And the military is estimated to be around 17,000 personnel short of what it needs. Netanyahu's coalition depends on parties representing the ultra-Orthodox community, and those parties have made clear that any changes to the draft exemption are a red line. The result is a government trapped between military necessity and political survival. None of this means Netanyahu is finished. He has survived the announcement of his political obituary more times than any reasonable observer would have predicted. But the pressure is real, and October's elections will be a genuine test of whether the Israeli public is ready for a different kind of leadership or whether, as has happened before, the fragmentation of the opposition allows him to return once again. The week ahead may offer the first real indication of whether this entire conflict has a diplomatic off-ramp or whether the region is heading back into a cycle of violence with no end in sight. Iran is under economic pressure that is genuine and accelerating. The United States is betting that pressure will eventually force a more favorable deal than anything currently on the table. Lebanon is navigating a negotiation that is historically without precedent but structurally very difficult, and Israel is prosecuting a war whose military logic remains defensible but whose political sustainability is increasingly in question. What happens next in that quiet window between collapse talks and the next round of proposals may determine the shape of the Middle East for a generation. We'll be watching it closely.